I think what we'll do is, as on the phone, we'll take a block of the public commenters, and then we'll pause and just ask if there are any follow-ups from the board to keep things moving along. That seems to work relatively well on the public health conference. So with that, I think we're ready to begin. And first on the list, we have Katie Brown, registered to speak. Yes, please go to the mic and take your position there. We look forward to your comments, Ms. Brown.
Good morning. I am Dr. Katie Brown, and I am the team lead and spokesperson for Energy in Depth, which is a research and education program of the Independent Petroleum Association of America. After months of deliberation and 3 separate, over 100-page draft recommendations, not once has the SAB panel pointed to any evidence that contradicts EPA's finding of no widespread systemic impacts to drinking water. Further, 4 SAB panel members have made this abundantly clear in an opinion that states, quote, "The statement by the EPA in the draft assessment report issued in June 2015 is clear, unambiguous, and does not need to be changed or modified," end quote. Hydraulic fracturing has been extensively studied since its first commercial application in the 1940s. EPA's findings not only mirror what the agency has previously found, but are also right in line with what scientists have repeatedly concluded in peer-reviewed research. In 2004, EPA published a separate comprehensive assessment of potential groundwater impacts from hydraulic fracturing and found that it, quote, "poses little to no threat to underground sources of drinking water," end quote. A new study by researchers at the University of Cincinnati, which evaluated baseline samples, found, quote, "no evidence for natural gas contamination from shale oil and gas mining," end quote. A recent landmark study by the Department of Energy, in which researchers injected tracers into hydraulic fracturing fluid, found no groundwater contamination after 12 months of monitoring. And this is just the beginning. Studies by the U.S. Geological Survey, Government Accountability Office, Groundwater Protection Council, California Council on Science and Technology, Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality have found that fracking does not pose a threat to drinking water. Studies by numerous universities, such as MIT, University of Texas at Austin, University of Syracuse, and Yale, just to name a few, have come to exactly the same conclusion. EPA's landmark groundwater study took 5 years to complete, and as EPA itself has acknowledged, it is one of the most comprehensive studies ever to be done on hydraulic fracturing. The bottom line is that if there were any evidence to suggest widespread systemic impacts to drinking water from hydraulic fracturing, it would have been uncovered in the past decade of extensive research. The SAB should ensure that it maintains its role as a scientific body and bases its recommendations on the science and the facts. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much for your comments. Next up, we have Hugh MacMillan, Food and Water Watch.
Morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. My name is Hugh MacMillan. I'm an applied mathematician and computational scientist. I'm well versed in the methods used by George Brides et al. And the modeling done as part of the draft assessment. And I can confirm that that modeling is in its early stages and far from predictive, as made clear in the panel's report under quality review today. 5 years ago, after serving as a AAAS Congressional Fellow in the Senate, I joined Food and Water Watch as a researcher and analyst. We help people and communities organize and take action against corporate abuse and government neglect when it comes to food and water. When Congress requested the hydraulic fracturing study, it asked EPA, quote, to carry out a study of the relationship between hydraulic fracturing and drinking water resources. The relationship begins with the construction of hydraulic fracturing wells and extends indefinitely through the abandonment and reclamation of well sites. But with the top line finding of its June 2015 draft assessment, the EPA went beyond the study of this relationship. The agency went on a limb and dismissed the impacts to drinking water as not widespread systemic, as if that should be the threshold. Industry argues that the dictionary definition of widespread should suffice, but this reinforces my point. Imagine being among those harmed and hearing at least the impacts aren't widespread systemic. Even so, the review panel's report exposes the agency for not having a clear scientific basis to support its controversial top-line finding. The agency only defined widespread systemic implicitly as being beyond current levels of damage. Yet, as the panel has made clear, EPA fell far short of quantifying the frequency and severity of the actual impacts to drinking water resources. In their 2008 book, Bending Science, How Special Interests Corrupt Public Health Research, the legal scholars Thomas McGarity and Wendy Wagner wrote the following: "The most important thing upper-level policymakers can do to prevent public misunderstanding is to be candid about the extent to which their final decisions rest on science and the extent to which policy considerations fill the gaps left by scientific uncertainties." By this measure, the EPA failed when it chose, as one panelist has put it, to run with the widespread systemic line. That choice injected politics into the study and fractured the SAB review panel along ideological lines, leading to the thin dissent over the semantics of the widespread systemic line. I trust that this fracture will not extend farther out of zone, so to speak, into the chartered SAB. After all, what could be more anti-science than dissenting from a recommendation for scientific clarity? Adding more qualifying terms before widespread systemic won't fix the problems with the controversial line. We urge you to convey the sense of the panel to the EPA with high fidelity. The EPA's reliance on voluntary cooperation from industry for data and for access to well sites shaped the science in the draft assessment. An untold number of contamination cases are hidden through sealed court settlements, and this also shapes the science. You will hear today from some of the people who have been impacted. Please keep in mind that they are also speaking for those under gag orders. The EPA owes it to these people to be clear about where the science ended and where the policy considerations began in the writing of the top line. Of course, the question still remains, how has it all come to this? Food and Water Watch built an elaborate online timeline to help everyone, including ourselves, understand the historical and political context of the study. Flip through the timeline, you will see how current U.S. energy policy has come to equate widespread fracking with energy security. The oil and gas industry is not alone in pushing this vision. For example, just 6 investment banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Citibank, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, and Goldman Sachs, account for $200 billion in lending exposure to the oil and gas industry. They expect to get paid back. They're banking on widespread fracking to maximize oil and gas production. The no widespread systemic impacts line was crucial to legitimizing this vision for the future. Should we really be equating widespread fracking with energy security? Here, widespread fracking means about 10 wells per square mile throughout its targeted region. Beyond the direct impacts on communities, the problem with equating widespread fracking with energy security is the scientific consensus on our climate and on climate pollution. Through climate change, widespread fracking poses unacceptable threats to our food, water, health, and economic security. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Thanks.
Good morning, and thank you for having me. My name is Erik Milito with the American Petroleum Institute, and I'm the Director of Upstream and Industry Operations. And for the last 14 years, I've worked on the operational, technical, scientific, legislative, and regulatory issues surrounding the development of the energy that fuels our everyday lives, and I've written extensively on hydraulic fracturing. And we have known for some time that hydraulic fracturing is an engineering technology that is safe and environmentally protective, that actually provides environmental benefits. But don't take my word for it, take the Department of Energy's. In the 90s, DOE studied hydraulic fracturing and various other oil and gas technologies. In 1999, during the Clinton administration, DOE released a report entitled The Environmental Benefits of Advanced Oil and Gas Exploration and Production Technology. In this report, DOE identified hydraulic fracturing as an advanced technology that provides environmental benefits. The benefits listed by DOE include optimized recovery of valuable oil and gas resources, fewer wells drilled resulting in less waste requiring disposal, and protection of groundwater resources. Let me repeat that. DOE identified protection of groundwater resources as an environmental benefit of hydraulic fracturing. We know this to be true today because hydraulic fracturing is inherently designed to protect groundwater resources. In its report, DOE acknowledged that hydraulic fracturing had already been applied more than 1 million times by 1988. And in the late 90s, about 25,000 wells were being hydraulically fractured annually. The only real changes since DOE released that report is that the technology has continued to improve. And we also know that, according to DOE, that today at least 2 million wells have been hydraulically fractured, and that up to 95% of new wells drilled today use hydraulic fracturing, accounting for more than 43% of our oil and 63% of our natural gas, and these numbers are expected to rise. The evidence is overwhelming, and sound science, the data, and the facts support by 100% EPA's statement that hydraulic fracturing activities have not led to widespread systemic impacts to drinking water resources. This technology has been applied more than 2 million times with no documented cases of groundwater contamination. The terms widespread and systemic are far from vague. They are clear and used properly by EPA in its draft assessment. You can only conclude there are no widespread systemic impacts. But the environmental impacts and the environmental benefits of hydraulic fracturing are far-reaching and should be embraced. I mentioned how this technology, when used with horizontal drilling, actually has effectively reduced our surface imprint, in some cases by more than 90%. And we're seeing also the results of far fewer wells being drilled because we know with relative certainty where the oil and gas is, so you're not hunting and gathering, you're harvesting resources now. But it goes far beyond that. Hydraulic fracturing has been a catalyzing force behind the recent decline in U.S. greenhouse gas emissions to near 20-year lows. This is because HF has unleashed vast supplies of clean, affordable gas, and this in turn has allowed natural gas to produce much more of America's electricity, with natural gas emitting half the carbon emissions as other sources and virtually no hazardous air pollutants. In other words, but for hydraulic fracturing, our carbon emissions today would be much higher. The consumer has also benefited through lower cost gasoline at the pump and lower cost natural gas for home heating, cooling, and electricity. And geopolitically, the U.S. has much greater leverage globally because our production here in the U.S. has effectively diminished the ability of countries like Russia and Iran to use energy as a geopolitical tool. We've seen Central and Eastern European countries come to the U.S. and praise our energy production because it puts them in a much better position. The energy minister from Lithuania was recently quoted as saying that this natural gas boom here in the U.S. is helping them geopolitically. Katie talked extensively about the research. Another study that was conducted by Milito and others tested 1,701 water wells in northeastern PA and found that shale gas extraction has not resulted in regional gas impacts on drinking water resources, and that methane in water wells is best correlated with topography and groundwater geochemistry rather than shale gas extraction. The science in support of EPA's conclusion of no widespread systemic impacts is credible and clear. Any other conclusion would simply ignore the science. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Milito. Next up, we'll hear from Kris Nygaard from ExxonMobil-upstream Research Company.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Kris Nygaard. I'm ExxonMobil's Senior Scientist for Hydraulic Fracturing Technologies. I have over 2 decades of extensive industry experience, and I've personally managed hundreds of hydraulic fracturing operations. I've been thoroughly engaged with the EPA's efforts on this topic. I've participated in several stakeholder workshops, co-chaired the well construction and modeling workshops, and peer-reviewed the EPA's 2015 Well Operator Files report. I have studied the draft assessment report in its entirety and commend the EPA's Office of Research and Development for the thoroughness and quality of its work. I respectfully urge the Science Advisory Board to accept the Hydraulic Fracturing Advisory Panel's recommendation to retain the draft assessment's main finding that there is no evidence of widespread systemic impacts on drinking water sources from hydraulic fracturing. This finding has strong justification in the years of study conducted by the EPA, including a detailed and careful review of more than 3,500 information sources. This finding is also clearly consistent with our broad experience throughout the country. As the board considers the panel's other recommendations, I urge you to return to first principles. Many have forgotten the original context in which the EPA drafted its top-line finding. First, the EPA explains that isolated instances such as spills or poor well construction have led to impacts on drinking water resources. But as EPA notes, the number of identified cases is small compared to the number of hydraulically fractured wells. This point is clearly articulated in the draft report. Such incidents are not widespread or systemic because the United States has in place a robust system of federal and state regulations to oversee resource development with hydraulic fracturing, covering all aspects of surface and subsurface operations. And these requirements have been tightened considerably over the 6-year course of the study. The enforcement of these rules ensures sound risk management practices are followed. The EPA's main finding underscores the effectiveness of the many federal and state agencies charged with the responsibility of environmental protection. Next, I'd like to comment on public understanding. The EPA's October 2015 charge to the Science Advisory Board described its draft assessment as a synthesis of the science, intended for use not only by federal, state, local, and tribal officials, but also by the public. The advisory panel also emphasized that the report remained understandable to a broad audience. However, the panel's recommendation to bog down the executive summary with more modifying adjectives will actually confuse many readers. Widespread and systemic are not difficult technical terms for scientists and the public. These are common sense words being properly used by the EPA to effectively communicate to the public. It was dismaying to see the panel devote hours of discussion to this syntax. A top-level finding is not the place for a myriad of technical caveats which already properly exist in the detailed body of the report. Finally, as a scientist, I was dismayed that the panel explicitly questioned the EPA's judgment, citing what it termed the limited factual basis upon which the agency reached its top-line finding. Such criticism was disturbing because the EPA reviewed over 3,500 sources, and the panel specifically highlighted 6 studies on page 140, apparently without realizing EPA had already cited several of these throughout the draft assessment, and specifically in Chapter 10. The panel further mischaracterized these 6 studies by suggesting they support the possibility of impacts without acknowledging the detailed text of these reports. For example, 2 reports explicitly rule out hydraulic fracturing as a potential contamination source, and the authors of one report summarize its findings as, the study found no systemic statistical evidence of impacts. The panel also revealed a lack of balance by not highlighting several recent studies that found broader groundwater impacts from unconventional oil and gas development, that found no groundwater impacts from unconventional oil and gas development. We should all expect more from the peer review process. The EPA has clearly, concisely, and accurately synthesized thousands of studies in a way that is understandable by a broad audience. Thank you for the opportunity to address the board today. I appreciate your time and consideration.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nygaard. Next up, we have Kris Stevens from Patriots from the oil and gas shales. Oh, Craig. Okay, my apologies.
I like to fly the flag out here. That's $4.3 million won by the Ely family. I'm Craig Stevens. March 10th, $4.3 million federal lawsuit jury trial. You're going to have many of the members of the industry here. They outnumber us about 3 to 1. I'm a former right-wing constitutional conservative, pro-drill, 115-acre, 6th-generation landowner. All excited about making money with this until I found out how they do it. They poke holes in the ground and poison people's water. 33 water wells went bad in Demet, Pennsylvania in the week of September 11, 2008. That's proven. This is fact. DEP fined them $1 million for it. They also made them put $4.3 million in a fund for those families. You're going to have many of the industry here because they're broke, folks. Halliburton laid off almost half its workforce. Chesapeake moved out of Pennsylvania. So they're desperately hoping that you'll pass this document. And by the way, here is the document. I'm wearing my father's jacket. He was 63 years in the Civil Air Patrol as an emergency first responder. There's the document we're talking about right now. My dad said, look for what's not included. What's not included is the ATSDR health consultation that was just released on May 24th. This document explains in December of 2011, long before the EPA even came in and tested endemic, that the families there had been living for 3 years with contaminated water. 27 water wells were so contaminated that they required and asked for a health study to be done on those families. It was supposed to start in January of 2012 when the EPA came in. That study never started. The DEP never did it in Pennsylvania. The gentleman before me said that the states are covering this. Yeah, they're covering it up. Remember, silence is the sound of money talking. I have $200 million of fake money here. It's the same fake promise we were made by all these drilling companies that came to make us shalionaires. I didn't become a shalionaire. I can't live at my property anymore because my water was poisoned. My 4 children, who were supposed to be the 7th generation landowners, cannot live at the property anymore because the water was poisoned. My unborn grandchild, due in November. This is who I'm here speaking for. Speaking for my deceased father, my deceased mother, who would never hesitate to stand in front of evil and tell them, stop contaminating us. This document is profound, and it is from the ATSDR and the CDC. You can find it easily. Let's talk about air. Why was air not included in this? Susquehanna County has the pleasure or displeasure of having 45 compressor stations pushing this frac gas. We have the most compressor stations in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in one county, and the most in almost any other county in the United States. Would you like to know on January 29th, the ATSDR released a study on what comes out of compressor stations. Why am I bringing this up now? Because this frac gas is full of a lot of nasty things that blow off and go into the air, including formaldehyde. If you live within 2 miles, this document says, of a compressor station for frac gas to push through, you're being embalmed. Formaldehyde levels off the charts, benzene, toluene, xylene, all the B-texes. Come on, folks. The industry's going to tell you water vapor is coming out of those things. Water vapor doesn't make you choke and gag and have rashes and for children to projectile vomit. This is not science. I don't need science on this. When my neighbor can put his water in a plastic jug outside when it's 20 degrees outside for 2 nights and it won't freeze, I don't need to be a scientist to figure out there might be something wrong with the water. Luckily, many families' water turned like this. It looks like carbonated diarrhea and smells like a dead skunk. I'm not kidding. Come and see it, breathe it, and smell it yourself. But mine stayed clear. It was the metal taste that got me interested, and 2 weeks after that, March of 2013, of the metal taste, I began to have spontaneous nosebleeds for 2 solid weeks. I even called our Department of Health. They ignored all of us that called, begging for help. I'm not here to destroy the industry. They've done a good job themselves. They've overproduced. Tony and Graffia last week on the phone call, if you listened in, said that 77,000 wells have been drilled unconventionally in the last 8 years. More water and sand and chemicals have been put down the ground than the 1 million drilled before it. This is not your grandfather, your father and mother's wells. This is poison. And it gets in the water through many different ways, the entire fracking and setup process. My focus today is to educate you and ask you to look at not just the document. Why is the EPA not here themselves talking about this document? They've never showed up at one of these events. We're here. We're the people being harmed. I've been to 13 state houses, met with 8 governors, and they're listening to the industry say this is fine. If you let this document pass through, you're going to be responsible for poisoning and harming millions of people in the United States. The industry is in this for the money. I'm in this for the future. Your families will be affected also. My focus is protection. That's what I was raised by a guy who spent 63 years doing it. I look at the good people here on this panel. We believe in you and what you are going to do with this. You're going to look and find what's missing in this document and tell the EPA that their focus should be protection. They get $10 billion a year and have 17,000 employees. They can't figure out if water is being contaminated, and they need an air study too because we're all getting poisoned. Thank you very much for your time. I will look forward to any questions that you have.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Stevens, for your comments. Next up, we have Ray Kemble.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Kemble.
Dimick well water. This started back with me back in 2008 when Cabot came in to Dimick and Susquehanna County. They were ordered to do a pre-test of all water wells in Dimick prior to drilling. They were within 1,000 feet of every home water well. I have a pre-test here from them showing there was nothing in my water. Water started turning in Dimick. DEP came in, did the testing, showing 4 different grades of uranium, arsenic, silica, and the list goes on. Over 27 chemicals now in the water. That made DEP put a 9-mile moratorium into Dimick where they cannot drill or frack because of the contamination that was done. That moratorium is still in effect today because they cannot straighten out the problems. This is a map showing over 50 wells within a mile of my house and 4 compressor stations from a half mile to 2 miles from my home. I have a well failed across the street from my house, 500 feet from the front door. DEP comes in, lies to my face. That system has never been up and operational. Well, we have the flare footage showing it running and putting all the poison stuff into the air to where I can't breathe in my home. Never been working. Well, we have the video proving it. This prompted DEP of Pennsylvania to go after Cabot. This was done. 3 times these documents were signed. These are legal documents for the DEP and Cabot Oil and Gas signed by the head CEO. In these reports, they poisoned and contaminated the water of Dimick, Susquehanna County due to their gas drilling and fracking operation. They admitted, these are 3 documents which will be in my written statement. They proved they did this wrong. EPA came in. We told them everything went wrong here with DEP. EPA came in, and we were all looking for the white suits and everything else. God, we're gonna get some help. Well, EPA came in. First time they came in, they did the testing. They came back on March 13, 2012, and gave me a report. I looked at it. It was a spreadsheet. I said, "Where's the scientific proof? I don't want a spreadsheet. My 5-year-old grandson can make on a computer. I want to see the science. We're going to come back and explain it to you." They did. They get back March 20th with another report. "This one's right. The first one's wrong. We need that one back, and here's the right one." I said, "Thank you. Get off my property." They changed the levels, so now the water's not contaminated. EPA went national in 2012 on July 22nd. There's nothing wrong with the water in Dimick, Parker County, or Pavilion. Everything is just fine. Then why'd you write this report on the 23rd of July telling me my water's contaminated, do not drink or bathe in it after you went national? I have a problem with EPA. They're lying. The Dimick Health Study report came out that they just released showing that everything is contaminated and it's wrong. This is a problem, okay? And the tests prove it here. What we've been saying for years, that the water is contaminated in Dimick. They turned around, the agents that were at our homes released this PowerPoint presentation to the LA Times that went across the country, showing that their testing was wrong and the water in Dimick was contaminated due to gas drilling and fracking. The agents came back to us, off the record, Ray, "Scott, we're gonna try to help you. Don't use the word that's contaminated because all the tests are a lie." And, I mean, this came from the agents telling us this off the record. I told them there's nothing off the record. I won't repeat what you said to me. The air study came out, same thing that the previous person just said, showing that the air is contaminated with all the different chemicals, which again, I am submitting this in my written statement. You know, these people cannot be wrong since the testing was done with the water and everything at Dimick was done side by side by EPA and them. So how can you have 2 agencies sitting there taking the same water at the exact same time and come up one that's totally wrong and the other one's totally right? I believe the signs I just got showing the water is contaminated. So I really do believe that, we need to open up a federal investigation and literally go down to all the local governments, governors, and everybody else, industry, and just tear them apart. This really needs to be checked out for everybody, for the world. This is a worldwide problem. This is not just here. This is air and water for everybody. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is or who you are. I am an ex-worker. I worked in the industry for 3.5 years, so I know some of the stuff that's going on. I'm not a rocket scientist, but I worked it and I know. So, and the other problem I have, the Halliburton loophole needs to be overturned and thrown in the garbage can. Any industry that comes into this country has to abide by the Clean Air and Water Act. So therefore, the industry should have to do the same thing and abide by the Clean Air and Water Act and protect the people. It needs to be overturned.
Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Kemble. Next up is Jim Zernell. Okay, Jim Zernell, please go ahead.
Mr. Carpenter, Chairman Thorne, and members of the advisory board, thank you for the opportunity for me to provide Newfield Exploration Company's comments on this very important subject. My name is Jim Zernell, and I'm Newfield's Vice President of Completions, and I'm also the company officer responsible for managing our safety, environmental, and regulatory compliance programs. For 28 years, Newfield has safely explored and developed oil and natural gas resources in 6 different countries on 4 continents, the Gulf of Mexico, and 9 different U.S. states. We are proud of our deep culture of executing in a safe and environmentally responsible manner. Our current areas of focus are in Oklahoma, Utah, Texas, and North Dakota, where we are active developers of unconventional oil resource reservoirs. We have over 1,000 employees, of whom more than 200 are degree engineers and geoscientists. More than 80% of our geoscientists have advanced degrees in their expertise. The exploration of drilling, completion, production operations of unconventional resources are sophisticated technical activities based on the science and technology advancements developed over the past 150 years. This includes hydraulic fracturing. For myself, I'm from St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. I'm a graduate of the Penn State University with a bachelor's degree in petroleum and natural gas engineering. I grew up as an outdoor enthusiast in the northwest part of the state, and to this day, my family and I still enjoy hunting, fishing, along with many other outdoor activities. We've always considered ourselves conservationists and stewards of the lands that we enjoy. Much of it has been on property with ongoing oil and gas operations, including in Pennsylvania. I'm here to testify as to my experience and hands-on knowledge spanning a 37-year career working in more than 8 states, including Alaska, plus offshore operations in the North Sea, Gulf of Mexico, the U.S. North Atlantic, and the Beaufort Sea. In all that time, I have never personally experienced or seen credible evidence in the areas I've worked of any groundwater contamination caused by hydraulic fracturing. I would propose to this panel that if in fact there were widespread and systemic impacts, that there are literally hundreds of thousands of horizontal shale wells that have been drilled in the past decade, and the millions and millions of hydraulic fracturing operations that have been completed all across the U.S. from coast to coast and border to border, it certainly would have been readily evident by now, even without the comprehensive studies done by the EPA and numerous others. To this point, Newfield and I personally support the scientific findings by the EPA that there has not been, nor does the operation of hydraulic fracturing pose widespread systemic impacts to the drinking water resources of the United States. I've read the numerous papers about the highly publicized investigations that we've all been addressing, and all of which have been studied by numerous government and non-government bodies, all of them coming up with the same conclusion as the EPA. So for the panel to propose that we continue to study these cases is an effort to keep hydraulic fracturing in a negative spotlight for the purpose of advancing either political or special interest group agendas, and is not really based on the facts or the science. The same negative spotlight has resulted in a campaign of misinformation by fossil fuel opponents who have distorted the facts around the entire oil and gas industry and created a level of hysteria around hydraulic fracturing purely for the purpose of branding all oil and gas activities as negative or harmful. Consider just what's going on in New York, where they've been embroiled in a debate over the Constitution gas pipeline, even though the state, like most of its neighbors, has had gas pipelines crisscrossing through it for decades, long before the fossil fuel activists started their negative campaign against the industry. I'll close by saying that we believe, Newfield and I, that the panel should accept the summary findings of the EPA, which are based on the facts and science. To advise the EPA otherwise is to discount the results of the large body of technical data and would only serve to bolster the fossil fuel activists who continue to make the wild claims of rampant damage. Thank you for your time and allow me to address you on this important topic, share my knowledge and my observations.
Okay, thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Zernell. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to hear from Aaron Menzies. Yes.
Morning.
Morning.
Thank you for the opportunity to provide public comment. My name is Aaron Menzies. I'm with Earthworks. Earthworks is a nonprofit organization that protects communities and the environment from the impacts of energy development while seeking sustainable solutions. I'm going to be very brief. First of all, I wanted to mention that I support the Science Advisory Board's decision to revisit the widespread and systemic claim that came out in the initial report. I'd like to associate myself and Earthworks with comments you heard earlier from Ray and Craig and Hugh at Food and Water Watch. And then finally, I would like to propose that this board, this Scientific Advisory Board, consider the peer-reviewed paper in the Environmental and Science and Technology Journal from Dominic DeGiulio at the Pavilion study. The decision by this board to revisit Pavilion and Parker County and Dimmick is an important one, so I would urge you to consider that peer-reviewed study that was recently published. In addition to that, with respect to the Parker County case, I would urge this board to consider the EPA's Office of Inspector General's report from December of 2013. That report vindicates our friend Steve Lipsky's and Shiloh Lipsky's claim. You heard him testify before you too. It also vindicated the EPA when the EPA concluded that range resources poisoned the Lipsky's wells. You'll hear from Range later. The OIG report concluded that that's exactly what happened. Finally, you already heard Ray and Craig talk about the Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry in Dimmick, their health consultation report. So those three, please. The Environmental Science and Technology report out of Pavilion, the EPA OIG report in Parker County, and then finally, the ATSTR report. Pavilion, Texas, Pennsylvania, that's widespread. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your comments. So we've heard now from 8 public commenters, and I just want to ask members of the Science Advisory Board who are here and the 2 who are on the telephone, if you have any follow-up questions you'd like to ask of any of those first 8 speakers. I see one tag up. Okay, go ahead, Michael.
Is this on now? Yes, it is. So I have a question for Dr. Nygaard with ExxonMobil-upstream research company. Dr. Nygaard, you had, I think, perhaps I got this wrong, admitted to the occasional problems from hydrofracking. And in the comments from our SAB panel, the SAB panel, page B-3, one of the appendices, talks about a small percentage of wells that are affected or maybe misaffected by hydrofracking done incorrectly. So the question, Dr. Nygaard, is what percent, in your opinion, is that percent a small percent, 1%, or is it 0.1%? In your experience, what is the number of wells that are affected that aren't done right, and therefore we do have groundwater contamination problems, please?
Yeah, if you could go to the mic to answer, that'd be very helpful. That way we can have it heard by folks on the teleconference.
So the question was, what percent of wells have been affected, hydraulic fracture has affected groundwater? The way I would address that is in the context The statement I made was there have been documented instances of well construction issues that have led to groundwater events. There's a substantial body of information and reports out in the literature. What I'd refer the readers to is a report that's available through the Groundwater Protection Council, KEL, and it actually summarizes several 100,000 wells data consisting of data from Ohio and Texas to provide statistics on the frequency of events associated with well operations. And you look at that report, it goes back through a broad two decades set of information, and they have a range of percentages described in that report. I can't recall the percentages off the top of my head, but it's a small, minor fraction. And they actually break them out into surface issues, perhaps cementing issues, and a range of issues associated with well construction. And there was not any identification of hydraulic fracturing to hydraulic fracturing activities leading to groundwater contamination issues. So that's the context I'd answer that question with. I refer to the KEL report, gives a broad perspective, instances associated with well construction, well integrity, not hydraulic fracturing.
Thank you.
Other comments or questions from the board? Follow-up questions? Okay, Dr. Solomon.
I'm sorry, sorry to bring you back up one more time, but I got a little confused there. I missed the reference, and then also I understand that the issues were with well integrity, not specifically with hydraulic fracturing, but it still does seem that if the well integrity is compromised, there's a potential issue there. So I just want to make sure that we're aware of the percentages. And perhaps one of the other public commenters is more familiar with that report, or as one of the members of the panel as those members, because I think it's an interesting question.
I can provide that reference explicitly later. I just don't recall it off the top of my head. It's KEL, approximately 2013, and so we can follow up with that. And to that point, it is a well integrity question and a well integrity issue. There's been a range of regulations put in place, a range of industry practices put in place for cementing well construction, both from a historical perspective and here over the last several years. Industry, API, has come out and published practices associated with hydraulic fracturing, surface water management, the HF1, API HF1, HF2, HF3 series of documents. Those are references in the broad literature as well.
Dr. Brown, did you have something to contribute?
Yes, so Energy in Depth has looked at that study extensively, and the percentages are a fraction of 1%, and it looks at wells in Ohio and Texas. And then another separate study done by the Associated Press, it was looking at well casing data in Pennsylvania, and it found that it was about a third of 1% of wells that had any issues.
So, Dr. Nygaard, while you're up there, let me just make sure I understand one thing that you said and pointed out. So, when you talk about hydraulic fracturing, you're distinguishing that from surface issue problems that arise during hydraulic fracturing and cementing issues that arise as a component of hydraulic fracturing. You're putting those in different categories.
That's
of
correct.
fracturing.
I'm speaking directly to the hydraulic fracturing, the pumping and injecting of the fracturing fluid downhole, separate from the well construction activities that occur within any well.
Okay, I just want to make that clear to everybody. Thank you very much. Could you turn off? Sorry, could you turn off that other thing? Bill Scott. Thanks. Okay, let me just check with Dr. Wilson, Dr. Mahina on the phone. Make sure that you let me know if you have any follow-up questions you want to ask. I see a couple cards up down there. Are those residual or?
I'm done. Pardon me.
John, go ahead.
Yes, the citizens who testified, if you could clarify,
in the sense of those areas you discussed, was it hydraulic fracking in the area, and what's been the conclusion that the local impact of all those wells? Was it through hydraulic fracking and the number of wells that were impacted? And was it ever investigated to find out, was it actually in the surface, you know, some of the discussion with regard to the small percentage that had problems? What did they find out with regard to the local impacts in the areas that you guys have been impacted by?
Ray will cover what happened endemic to him early.
Excuse me, let me just say for the folks who are on the phone on the panel that Craig Stevens and Ray Kemble have come to the mic. Thank you.
So let me cover what happened after EPA left. That's more important. EPA came in for 6 months and tested 64 water wells. They then came back and basically sat down and lied to everybody. We know that because the people that didn't want to be lying to people said, off the record, your water's really poison, don't get in it. But let's see what happened in Pennsylvania after that. When the EPA does that, the whole world says, hey, it's safe. So our governor allowed them to move forward. There are 7 trapped wells on that December 15, 2010 DEP Cabot Oil and Gas Consent Order, which caused the 9 square mile. It's very important for this panel to know that. You have 7 trapped wells that were vertically drilled, horizontally bored, but were never finished. That means fracking process. So you'd be happy to know that the governor green-lighted them to move forward. Our illustrious governor, Governor Corbett, who I affectionately call Governor Drillbit. So Governor Drillbit said they could move forward and do that because it was not fair that those were trapped. They could not drill any new wells, and they have not to this date, 5 years later. Why is that important? They did only 3 wells, 3 frack jobs out of 7, and they stopped. Does anybody here want to know why? 6 brand new cases of water contamination happened. So we have evidence that nobody has ever bothered to come and even look at. You might want to come, because Ray's water changed along with many others and brand new people. 3 of those people that water changed had a DEMIC Proud sign, pro drill, from Energy and Death. That's DEMIC Proud, Cabot. So when you're DEMIC Proud and you don't believe any of your idiot neighbors who were in a lawsuit for 5 years, but your water changes when they frack a well, frack only. So I have a great scientific experiment, a 9 square mile area where they drilled for 2.5 years. They were told to stop by the DEP, ordered to stop. But once the EPA came in and lied to everybody, and I'm saying that out loud on the mic, is this on? They lied to all of us. So the whole world said there's no problems. And now they let them finish. Why did Cabot, there's your question, scientists, why did they only do 3 if they were authorized to do 7? They stopped at 3 because the water started going bad or worse in the same area. So we have proof that nobody has ever come to. Ray will tell you, we called DEP, they hung up on him. We called EPA. He had to call the National Response Center to tell him his water had gone 100 times worse after the recent. That was in November of 2012. That is after. So there's the key. We have a direct evidence that hydraulic fracturing process alone caused water quality changes in endemic Pennsylvania after the EPA came in and said the water's fine. Ray will extrapolate. And I want to say one last thing that I didn't say earlier. On the same day, on May 24th, look it up, a FOIA was done on EPA, and in the last year, they put together 32,000 internal emails on the DEMIC water investigation. 32,000 emails that represent 800,000 documents. Might be worth looking at, because we're already finding things like this. A question from one of the investigators or another, why are we finding arsenic in the water that Cabot is delivering to the water buffaloes for these families? They're finding contaminants in the water delivered for them to use in their homes that is being paid for by the company that did the damage. That's one document of 800,000. You might want to look at that too. They should be included in this. Go ahead, Ray.
The casings have failed up there in DEMIC. Last study we heard it was almost 18% of the well casings have failed. That's the concrete and the steel. Right around my house itself, there is 1, 2, 3, 4. There is 5 failed wells that were ordered plugged right in the drilling process, a total failure. They were ordered plugged, and it was I guess for 3, Baker 1, Baker 3, I think it was. They were just ordered to plug Costello 1 4 years ago. That was ordered to be plugged due to total failure. Industry turned and said, hell no, we got too much money invested in that. We're not going to shut it down. So there's an order from DEP to plug a well, and industry totally ignores it. and the well is still there and it's still vaporing off and they're still putting it off in the atmosphere. I think it's 18% right now is failed in Susquehanna County. You take Dimmick, you got Hot Bottom, you have New Milford, you have Lennox, you have Franklin Forks, Rush. These are all towns that have contaminated water due to the gas drilling and fracking process, which has been proven by our government, DEP. So that's where it's sitting at right now.
Okay, thank you very much for that. John, that answered your question?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Seeing no other flags up, let's continue then, please. Okay, so next on our list is Robert McCaslin.
Ani, how are you? Good morning.
Morning.
Robert McCaslin. I'm a tribal member of the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians and former 32-year-old master driller. The reason why I'm here today is to speak about is hydraulic fracturing. And we had guard gates go up, and I wanted to treat everybody here like family because it's safety first, and we drove to zero. And in this case, it's not true. The driving to zero and the safety first, I've never seen anybody out on the pad in my career. And lately I've been looking into the investigation part of the DEP in Pennsylvania. This is what I discovered. 8 years of research in about 3 months. And with all the fines and stuff, and the people still being contaminated, just outside the no trespassing sign, we put up barriers in the course of history here. I'd like to take you back a little bit, but we didn't see those back in the 80s. 1981, the shell gas was documented to be radioactive. I was working for Miller Brothers back at that time. I was pretty young and I didn't understand what was going on at this time. And so plunging forward, it was the antrim shell. And that shell was a type form to extract the gas. So later in history, as I formed my way out to Colorado, California, Wyoming, and off in the Gulf, and seen lots of nobody there but our crew. That's it. All this paper shuffling that's being done right now, I look at the people that's being impacted right now. Out of 27 wells that I researched the last 3 months, only 3 of them would have had been even close to having integrity. That trespassing sign is here. We're drilling out there. That's what's happening to the people. I got 20 people out there already contaminated. It's 8 years. I do have lots of proof and lots of paper shuffling, and as a driller, we always know when we hit a gas pocket that we would probably raise our bed off the bottom and circulate the gas out. And what I'm metaphoring by that is if we, let it circulate out here, that nobody would have been infected out there. We'd have just stopped what we was doing. But instead, this increased, causing a higher potential of each and every one of those wells that were being drilled. Likable communicators underneath. As I look at when they said they decreased, in some of the comments here, I see the increase of pattern in this directional way of going. So it doesn't matter where you're sitting at the table right now. You know, I'd like to thank each and every one of you, if you take the time and get with, you know, the facts. And the facts are that this is unsafe, this is harming us. I take in my opinion, that it's like Halloween in the DEP in Pennsylvania. By what I mean like that is when in 2007, when the increase of well permits and everything increased, and they were passing them out like jars of candy to these operators over there. And when they get near a school, it's too close. I would never want my child by a school to be on my rig. Matter of fact, that probably would only take a few hands with me, you know. But when it comes to the potential dangers and everything that we face, we didn't drive to zero, we covered it up. I'm looking at all the worker history and all the...
Mr. McCaslin, could you wrap up, please?
Okay, that's saying me which.
Thank you very much, Mr. McCaslin, for your comments. Next up is to hear from Melissa Troutman from Public Herald.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Better turn that down. I'm recording myself. Pretty loud. So, yes, I'm Melissa Troutman. I am a journalist and the executive director of Public Herald. We're a nonprofit investigative news organization, and we have pretty exclusively investigated fracking's impacts on water in Pennsylvania since 2010. I'm here to request a federal investigation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, for ignoring evidence that clearly shows contamination of drinking water related to the development of shale oil and gas that has impacted residents in Pennsylvania for years, subjecting them to illness and disease through exposure to toxins through their drinking water. 5 years of our investigations at Public Herald have revealed that there is substantially more water contamination in Pennsylvania than either EPA or PADEP have acknowledged, in favor of diluted and blatantly false conclusions about the potential impacts of unconventional oil and gas fracking. Any assessment of how widespread and systemic the impacts of fracking are on drinking water should start with the aggregation of water contamination cases and include all water contamination clusters, not just DMIC. Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection gives the impression that they do this by publishing a PDF online that lists all of the cases DEP has confirmed of water contamination. However, these are far from all of the water contamination cases that actually exist. How do we know this? Since 2013, Public Herald has aggregated, mapped, and published all water contamination complaints for 17 of 40 fracked counties in Pennsylvania. At first, DEP would not give us this information. They claimed it was confidential, but with enough bulldogging and hiring attorneys, we eventually got the files. We are still collecting them. These data maps that we have published at publicfiles.org show where water pollution clusters have occurred, cases that specific officials at DEP have knowingly kept hidden. The number of contamination cases is far greater than the 278 that DEP has confirmed. Public Herald has analyzed over 200 cases in 5 key townships where clusters have occurred to find that PADEP has 9 ways that it systematically keeps water contamination cases off the books. One of these ways is by simply dismissing clean pre-drill tests, which is highly unscientific. If EPA had reviewed the 2,309 cases obtained by our newsroom and released in September 2015, we'd be sitting here discussing how best to place the field workers, administrative staff, and supervisors of DEP who knowingly put the public in harm's way by neglecting their duties and using politics instead of science to make decisions. The data in these complaint records clearly shows a trail and pattern of impacts to drinking water, but also a pattern of regulatory indifference, neglect, partiality, and bias to the industry. These records, when analyzed with the intent to protect the public health and environment, prove that DEP has acted criminally. All of them are available, again, at publicfiles.org, mapped by county and township. Click on a county, click on the township, all of the files will be listed underneath. The DEP allowed drinking water supplies to be contaminated with permits from their office, then, when made aware of that contamination, allowed the pollution, poisons, and toxic water to be kept off the books, is no less criminal than the acts perpetuated by officials now facing criminal charges for the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. For 8 years, DEP has knowingly suppressed, withheld, and covered up hundreds of water contamination cases in Pennsylvania that we know of. In this room sit industry officials who've happily sat back to watch families sign non-disclosure agreement after non-disclosure agreement while DEP shrouds the public from this data. The only place you can get these water contamination cases, as an aggregate by the way, is publicfiles.org. These companies are afforded some of the best economic protections in America, where they are allowed to contaminate aquifer after aquifer and still be granted new permits only months after these violations. And this doesn't mean EPA is off the hook. Just as in Flint, both state and federal agencies are wading in rivers of evidence without acting on it. How many DMIC cases does the EPA think there are in 2,309 water contamination complaints? And how many does there need to be for EPA to act in a manner where they declare the state regulatory agency incapable of performing its duties? How many cases need to be in these records for the federal government to open a criminal investigation of the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection? Thank you. All of you sitting here today may not know the answer to these questions, but I can assure you that our team at Public Herald knows that the ceiling has been reached. I'm speaking to you today in the hopes that you'll use this evidence to do what is right and that you'll move to opening a criminal investigation of Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. I hope that the corruption of public health and public trust will be vindicated by a federal investigation and a hearing before the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee like there was for Flint, Michigan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next on our list is Scott Gale. Are you here, Mr. Gale? Okay, from Halliburton Energy Services Incorporated.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, good morning. My name is Scott Gale. I am the Strategic Business Manager for Production Enhancement for Halliburton Energy Services. Halliburton is a global leader with respect to hydraulic fracturing and is at the forefront of industry innovations. Halliburton has devoted substantial resources to developing hydraulic fracturing, or HF, technologies, including a fracturing fluid sourced from the food industry, additives that enhance the reuse of produced water, and a treatment system that uses ultraviolet light rather than chemicals to control the growth of bacteria. Halliburton appreciates the work of the Hydraulic Fracturing Research Advisory Panel and the time and effort put in by the panel members. We agree with a number of the conclusions and recommendations set forth in the panel's report concerning EPA's draft assessment of the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water. At the same time, we have a number of significant concerns regarding the panel's report. Our first concern is that the panel continues to criticize the EPA's conclusion that it did not find evidence that the mechanisms for potential impact from HF have led to, quote, widespread systemic impacts to drinking water resources, end quote. We agree with EPA's conclusion as written, and additionally, we agree with several of the dissenting panel members that this conclusion is clear as it stands and does not need to be modified with further qualifiers. We also believe that EPA could have stated its conclusion more strongly because there is nothing in the EPA assessment indicating that HF is having widespread systemic effects that somehow have yet to be identified. If HF did cause systemic impacts, those impacts would have been evident long before EPA began its review given HF's nearly 70-year history. Extensive data support this conclusion, including studies that have evaluated regional groundwater and surface water monitoring data in areas where HF operations have occurred. Numerous studies, which we have cited in prior comments, have concluded that there is no evidence of measurable impacts of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water resources on a regional basis. While a number of the studies cited by the panel purport to reach a different conclusion, those studies should be viewed with caution for the reasons we have identified in our prior comments to the panel, while others need to be re-reviewed to avoid mischaracterization of the findings. Second, we continue to believe that the panel should recommend that EPA's assessment distinguish between what is directly related to hydraulic fracturing and what is incidental or unrelated. The panel's report at times makes this distinction but is not consistent. The directive from Congress to EPA was to study the relationship between drinking water and HF, not oil and gas operations generally. Viewing all activities associated with a well that may at some point be hydraulically fractured as related to HF or the HF water cycle results in misleading labeling of a variety of activities as HF related. For example, drilling muds are used as part of the well drilling process regardless of whether the well is hydraulically fractured. Their disposal has absolutely nothing to do with the HF process and is not relevant to the congressional directive. The panel's recommendation that EPA discuss the disposal of muds in its assessment only serves to perpetuate the myth that all concerns regarding oil and gas development can be laid at the feet of HF and does not contribute to public understanding regarding HF. In addition, the panel overstates uncertainties regarding information available on FracFocus. FracFocus and state databases provide a wealth of information on the chemicals used in HF operations across the country. Trade secret protection is not an impediment to assessing potential risks, given that EPA found that most chemicals used in HF operations, approximately 89%, are specifically identified in FracFocus. Moreover, even when the chemicals used are proprietary, EPA and states can obtain information on those chemicals from suppliers and provide general information to the public on the properties of the chemicals. We agree that the current version of FracFocus provides additional insights into the constituents used during HF operations. By supplementing its review and incorporating new FracFocus data, EPA will have an even more robust picture of the chemicals used in HF operations today. Finally, we believe that there is no need for EPA to address the investigations of Dimmock, Parker County, and Pavilion in its assessment. There is good reason to conclude that the drinking water issues in these three areas are not related to HF activities. For example, in Parker County, there have been no allegations that the stimulation of nearby oil and gas wells played any role in the observed methane levels in the wells of area residents. Including these three cases in the assessment would do nothing to contribute to an understanding of the impacts of HF operations on drinking water resources. EPA can respond to questions from members of the public regarding the status of these investigations independently of the assessment. Thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Gale. Next, we're going to hear from, well, let me just ask, have we reached Bill Tway? No, okay. Steve Gorzula, is that how you say it? Independent environmental consultant.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm an environmental scientist. I have a PhD from London University. That explains why I've got a funny accent. But I am an American citizen. I work on international development projects, and I've spent 26 years of my life physically present in developing countries. I specialize in environmental and social impact assessments of hydropower projects. And I've worked on energy projects in Brazil, Honduras, Mozambique, Nepal, Nigeria, Pakistan, Venezuela, and Vietnam. Depending on the project, I follow the guidelines of the World Bank and United States Agency for International Development. It might interest some of you that have also been a member of the Species Survival Commission of the IUCN since 1985. Does this experience qualify me to review in depth the EPA's draft assessment on potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing on oil and gas, for oil and gas on drinking water? Simple answer is, not really. And my areas of expertise do not cover oil and gas extraction. I'm therefore somewhat surprised that a highly technical piece of work such as this is required by the federal government to undergo a public hearing. My personal opinion is that a HESA, a highly influential scientific assessment, such as this should remain an internal agency document. I find it potentially dangerous to submit a document such as this to a public hearing, because one can end up trying to achieve technical and scientific truth by consensus. Anyway, I've reviewed the report to the best of my ability, and I've come to the conclusion that the dissenting conclusions of the 4 members of the Scientific Advisory Board are correct. I agree with them that there's no evidence of widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources. Again, as some people have mentioned, this is the hydraulic fracturing process. It's not sloppy work by a work group. The impacts identified so far for hydraulic fracking can be avoided and or mitigated by site-specific best practices and routine inspections. 3 suggestions that might make this report a little bit more user-friendly. There's a statement that hydraulic fracking occurs in 25 states. It would be nice to also have a simple geological map of the United States showing where hydraulic fracking is occurring and areas where it might occur in the future. And maybe some red dots showing where you've had major incidents caused by hydraulic fracking. Secondly, ESIAs that I work on have a cost-benefit component. And I would have liked to have seen a short discussion on how many jobs are generated by fracking and by how much fracking could offset our dependence on foreign oil. That would put things more into perspective. Thirdly, and I don't know whether you can do it, when I work on hydropower projects, we can categorize them very quickly by installed capacity, whether they're run-of-river or seasonal storage, their estimated useful life, and so on. I don't know if you can do something similar with hydraulic fracking, because I haven't got the slightest idea of the significance of individual wells. Are they all the same? I don't know. Finally, the polemic being levied against the fracking industry reminds me of the anti-dam lobbyists of the 1980s. Delays and cancelled projects caused hardship to millions of people in the developing world. Eventually, the lobbyists and the industry got together, and in the year 2000, the World Commission on Dams released its final reports on best practices that everybody follows today. And hopefully...
Can you wrap up? Can you wrap up, please?
Oh, I finished. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Next up, we'll hear from Felipe Einstein. Sorry, Einstein.